Hello, Rada. Nice
Hi,
having you. How are
thank
you
you.
doing?
Good, how are you today?
I'm doing amazing. I'm very curious because we met at SpeakC event and I checked the kinds of things you were doing in your life. And one interesting thing that I noticed is that you used to work with larger agencies until 2022. And then you shifted towards working with smaller companies, startups in the creative field, if I
hmm
could put it this way, in more kind
hmm
of like executive directorial positions. So I'm curious what made you, pushed you towards this shift, and like, what can you tell about these two different worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no surprise that anybody who's worked in corporate understands that there's a difficulty of working in big corporations because there's always a lot of red tape. And so when you want to get a lot of things done, especially at the rate that, for example, technology advances and there's so many more solutions, you hit a ceiling in big corporate companies. So after a while, I got kind of frustrated with that and really wanted to be at the forefront of innovation, trying, making mistakes, learning alongside my peers rather than getting held up in corporate like legal battles of this technology is new, we shouldn't try it yet, so on and so forth. So I really just wanted to stop holding myself back basically because as you know, the industry changes ever so quickly. And if I didn't make a drastic pivot in my career to really try new things and be where everybody is actually innovating, I was going to get left behind. And then it was going to be too late to pivot later on in life. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So what I'm hearing is that you traded comfort of corporate zones for having more impact in smaller firms. I think that's a typical dynamic, right?
Correct.
And we often do this as studios, right? We choose to dial down on the clients, like these big corporate accounts, in favor of working with smaller companies where you can make more impact. So, am I getting it right that was similar motivation on your side?
Yeah, of course. Not a lot of, I mean, I know that a lot of startups and, in Silicon Valley, et cetera, around the world now with, a lot of Web3 startups some have a lot of funding, some don't. And you could argue that you could make more money in a startup, but it's a lot more volatile. But I'll say that nobody leaves a cushy, like a corporate job because they think it's going to be comfortable on the other side. So, yeah.
Obviously, yeah. So it sounds like the pivot you made was in the very last moment. How does this align with the crisis that we're seeing in the creative and marketing industry, which essentially started late 2022? So that's more or less in the time where you started pivoting and taking more lead in your roles.
Right. No, so Web3 has been kind of like a buzzword that has been going around, I think, in our industry for a little bit, but you're seeing a lot more of it, especially with more and more crypto conferences popping up. You have Consensus, you have a bunch of them happening in overseas in Asia, but a lot of people still don't really know how it functions and how it works. I think there's a lot of solutions out there that are yet to be discovered. And a lot of bigger agencies really haven't wrapped their head around what that world is and what the solutions are prospectively for big clients. But then you have you have big brands like MasterCard who's participating and has been participating, for example, at these crypto conferences, being at the forefront of this technology. So they're going to want those solutions. Bigger brands are going to want those solutions, but the companies but the people that the big agencies, for example, and the big corporations hire, the people are not educated or exposed to the world that's coming at them full steam ahead.
Right. And in terms of Web3, because there is a lot of things that can come under this umbrella.
Yeah.
So if you could give a top-down perspective of like what is Web3 and what are the parts of Web3 which are the actual technologies worth focusing on, as
hmm
opposed to a lot of gimmicks and things which were, turned into vaporware or, money laundering schemes and this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm still obviously learning about a lot of it, but from what I've been exposed to in the last, I don't know, 2 years, what I can say that's going to be of most importance to bigger corporations outside of like, the NFTs and the tokens and the cryptocurrency of it all, because I think that's where most people's understanding of Web3 exists. But I think the functional aspects for business operations that Web3 can help evolve certain businesses is, around digital ownership of things, decentralization of just being reliant on middlemen, basically, is the simplest way I can explain it. Having trustless systems, again, middlemen, cutting out the middlemen, and then having more user sovereignty over your data, how you decide to share, who you're sharing it with, how you're seen and perceived online, and having control over your own data. So, and that's going to matter more and more to people, I think.
Right. So that's, in a nutshell, all the technologies that are based off of the blockchain, but without the flashy bits related to NFTs and cryptocurrencies. So using the
Right.
ground layer foundation in order to build something meaningful and really usable, as opposed to these gimmicky things that get trendy and get buried often. Am I
Yeah.
getting the word there right, or it's an
Yeah.
oversimplification?
No. I think that's the best simplified way to like explain it. I think that there's the issue of adapting to Web3 and the technologies that, because the technology is advancing, because there's no centralized, I guess, educational system. You go on YouTube, there's a bunch of stuff mostly talking about NFTs and tokens and like cryptocurrency and all that. And you have to imagine there are some legal firms around it that are starting to tackle the laws around that. But, even the government is trying to figure out how they can make their holding on the crypto world. So there's a lot of legal stuff still kind of morphing and changing and being figured out. So I think that's why a lot of people are afraid to even touch it, because they don't know where the red tape is of how far they can go with it.
And besides these things you mentioned, which are all technologies based off a blockchain, do things like VR, AR, and like virtual platforms and all these kind of things, that's also a part of Web3, is it, or it isn't? And is that in your interest, or?
I think it's like the creative side of harnessing. It's more of a tool for Web3, I think. I think it's an advanced technology that a lot of people don't have in their home. I mean, some people have VR headsets to play games and whatever, but I think those are all tools of how to access Web3, but it is part of the Web3 like ecosystem. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so back to the companies that you started working with.
Yes.
You worked with Rokani Studio in Germany, and then Mimicry, and well, you were managing director in one of them and member of the board of advisors in the second. So what is it exactly that you're doing, and why this kind of companies would like to work with someone like you? What do they benefit? What competence gaps can you plug in these companies?
Sure. Well, you and I have talked about how a lot of creative studios have been shutting down. And a lot of the reason, I think, or some of the reason, not just the economy, but some of them really don't understand how our business operations run, and all of the little things that come together to make a business run smoothly. And it's something as stupid and simple as having estimates and having NDAs and having your contracts in place and understanding your pricing structure and how to handle human capital, which is, resourcing, as big corporations call it. As you know, from my background, I have done such a huge variety of things. I've worked from digital, print, experiential, and all in this, like, all with like a flair or a tinge of like digital and creative and design. So I've always, my whole career as a whole has been entertainment and like the emergence of technology, design, and creativity. The underlayer of that is business operations and understanding how all that goes together. And a lot of companies don't know what that entails and how those go together and what the rules and regulations, business affairs basically, that go into it. So a lot of times I go in with the perspective of, hey, for lack of a better word, I'm like a Jane of all trades, where I understand the business from multiple perspectives, and I can not only educate, but I also help put the right landmarks in place to make sure that they're not missing something and covering their own behinds, because a lot of studios don't even have business insurance. And if you work with, for example, a big agency, say in America, you have to have insurance coverage for at least up to 2 million. And with the digital world and Web3 and AI, some of those insurance coverages are going up to 5 million. So you have to be prepared. Yeah. For real
Gotcha.
business. Yeah. And that's what I
So to simplify that, you would work with companies which are generally on the small side, meaning studios up to 10 people, something like that. And my understanding would be that they have their creative chops, to put it that way, or development if they are in web space or
Uh-huh.
software.
Uh-huh.
And you're bridging the gap to the business side, the processes and management of the company.
Correct. And the other side of it is I've had clients come to me directly, like a brand, for example, and they need a product done, and I resource that person for them and manage the whole process. So there's different ways that I interact with companies.
When you start working together with them, how does it look like? Because your contracts, they lasted around a year and a half. So is it more like a interim CEO position or a managing director, or it's more like freelance or an advisor? I'm trying to understand, what's the dynamic like?
It really depends on what they can afford. I mean, it all comes down to money, right? And it's not just, I'm not saying that I won't work with somebody if they don't have a budget. I'm just saying that if they have a bigger budget to bring me on more on a long-term basis, great. Then I can do more. Sometimes I see a product and I am more personally invested and I am willing to take less. So it really just depends. So yes, I do come in more depending on what they can afford and what they're comfortable with, because you can imagine people who start up their own studios, they don't want to just hire somebody that's just going to take over and rule over and, make decisions on their behalf. It's a partnership. We work together and
Hmm.
they hire me based on their comfort level. So a lot of the times I come in and I'm helping them give a perspective on, from my experience, on marketing efforts, who they should be talking to, how they should say something, how they should be putting themselves out there in the world, helping them sell through clients and figuring out the budgets for prospective jobs. Yeah, so I'm kind of doing all of it.
Right. Well, from my experience, this is the kind of information and competence that is oftentimes missing on the creative side, obviously. And of course, most of people in this industry, they start their businesses as creatives and learn business along the way, right? With better or worse results. Now, the question is like, at what stage do you come into these companies? Are these like super fresh startups that are just like maybe people with experience, but they are starting a company, or they must be operating at a certain level, let's say, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 million euro, or
Well, I don't want to go into numbers because out of respect for the people I've worked with, but I was like, for example, Matt Projects. Matt Projects has been around for 10 years. I had an actual role with them. Then I pivoted to freelance because that was better for me. And they'd been around for over 10 years now. So they were well established. But then when I moved to Paris and started working with Rukani Studio, I had known Rukani Studio for at least a year up at that point. And yeah, 2 years, 1 to 2 years. And Rukani has been around for 4 years. So it was at this point where they needed somebody to kind of help them, like I mentioned earlier, lay more of a groundwork for
Mhm.
future growth. So that's what I helped him with. And my measure of success is if I get a company to a point where they don't need me anymore, because I don't want to handhold all the time.
Mhm.
And I of those people where I either am fully immersed in the ecosystem of the company and I'm doing all of it, or I'm just here to fill a role to get you to a certain point and then I bow out.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And with the advisory role from Mimicry, which is an AI startup that started just 5 months ago, they're in this like very tender spot where they have a really great product. They're brand new and it's run by a female CEO. And I feel personally responsible in some way to be a good influence and be supportive for somebody that really needs it at the beginning of a venture. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So this ties in nicely with the way David Baker put it, which is, all advisors come as a liberating force on the beginning. And then the longer you stay with the company, the more this turns into the occupying force. I think it's very well phrased. So there is this sweet spot where you really want to get out before it's too late and things get a little bit stale and rotten. And
Yeah.
you're becoming an expense, because ultimately I think it's all about the knowledge transfer, right? And it
Yes.
goes in time. And obviously it's the highest on the very beginning, and then it only diminishes, right? So your value is at its peak on the beginning, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to give you a little story. My first job in high school was at Starbucks as a barista. And my role was everybody's got their role. It's not you're just a barista, you're making coffee. Everybody's got their operations role. So I was majority of the time a floater. And a floater is a person that just fills in the gap for any part of the station that needs help. Front of house, back of house, whatever needs your help and assistance with that might be lacking, especially during busy times. And I found that throughout my career and at major corporations, a person like myself, floater, is needed because you need that person that is going to be flexible enough who understands how all of the different facets of the company work to slip in and make sure that it keeps up. Because at one point or another, one of the departments is going to be lagging and it's going to harm the overall production and prosperity of the company if it's not held up properly. So that's the best way and simplest way I can explain what my profession is or like what my specialty is.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the thing which is, I guess, the most crucial right now, because the crisis in the creative and marketing industry has been going on for like 2 years, and we have our own perspectives on it. And I think the hanging question is, how do we adapt, and what are the things that changed in the industry which are making certain things, well, need to go away essentially, because we cannot sustain certain ways of doing things, and what are the things that we need to start doing moving forward in facing the situation that we see right now. Curious of your thoughts on this.
Well, I think the level of education anybody has is always how far anybody's going to go as far as understanding new technologies, right? So education is a fundamental part for any CEO. What I've seen a lot of, you and I have discussed earlier, that a lot of technology is obviously evolving very quickly. There's new programs coming out. Figma, for example, has overtaken the creative side away from like Adobe, right? So a lot of traditional artists or traditional studios that used to be more Adobe heavy, for example, who haven't integrated Figma into their process workflow, could be falling behind. So learning new technologies, learning the new things that other big studios are using, and adapting to that, because I think what a lot of studios don't understand is that they're only just one part of the workflow that bigger companies are using. So there's a whole other circuit. There's dev teams, there's media, there's just a different way, an emerging workflow of how people work. And you have to adapt to that and really be on top of how that is changing, whether you like it or not. So that's also participating in forums, that's being part of the community, that's attending conferences, and really, whether they're digital or in person, it's important to just keep connecting with what people are doing out there.
Gotcha. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's in line with my observations of the industry. Interestingly, it's the problem you mentioned, like not being aware of how the entire ecosystem works and what your role your company plays in the bigger ecosystem. That's a problem that I encountered working with some of clients of mine. In fact, based on that, I created the entire methodology, which is this part is called value chain mapping or creative value chain mapping. It doesn't have much to do with like the old school business value chain mapping, but I think it's a decent term and the way of thinking and looking at the industry so that you understand where you are. Because like, I'm talking to all these small companies, usually small studios, like up to 25 people, and they operate without a map of the industry. Like they don't know what's behind the hill, right? They don't know how their value compounds, because obviously the value stacks across the entire ecosystem. The amount of like business liberty is dictated not by your free will, but by the position you take in the value chain, right? If you're in the bottom, in the executional layer, discussing things like value pricing makes absolutely zero sense, because you're just a vendor to deliver some deliverables, right? And people don't understand that in order to switch to value-based pricing, for example, they need to be super close to the client and have much higher business stake. So this lack of understanding that I mapped from people I talked to gave birth to this concept of like value chain mapping, and essentially plotting these companies and plotting the entire ecosystems and making people understand where they fit and how the value compounds, right? because this is the only way to gain clarity, like business clarity on how these things work, and then make informed decisions in terms of, okay, so how am I going to create, communicate, and capture value, which is business 101.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's missing as hell in the creative industry. And from what you're saying, it seems that on the digital side, on the technology side, it's no different, right?
No, it's no different. And a lot of the value is caught up in jargon. So back to what I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of buzzwords that people are using when they're talking about their industry, but to the common person that's just trying to sell a product, yes, there's a certain level of education, but with the technical jargon that people are using these days, it's hard to express and make that the person on the other line understand the value that you're actually bringing to the table. So you could be a dev team and you're talking about your tech stack, and the only person that's going to understand that tech stack is going to be the CTO on the client side.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to give value of why you should work with say a dev team or any dev team or any creative studio, you have to appeal to a number of other things that gets you through the door in order to even talk to the CTO, where you kind of close the deal. I mean, I think to the point where you actually talk to the CTO, that's when the deal's pretty much almost done. You just have to make sure that there's proof in what you're doing, but the charm and the smoothing part and the relationship part with your client and it dumbing down like your value is the most important part of the process. It's getting them in the door. It's making them feel good about the potential money they're going to invest into working with you.
Well, I totally agree about the jargon part. I'm not so sure about dumbing it down, because I think in my perspective, this is about arriving at clarity about what is it that you really offer, right?
Oh, of course.
You said one thing that about like sealing the deal, and I can totally understand and see situations where, okay, you talk your development language, let's put it that way, and you can seal fairly good deals based only on that. But what you're sacrificing is you're essentially closing a door for your company to participate in higher business stake and having more business impact and responsibility. So essentially you're vendorifying yourself, meaning you will never go in that relationship past the vendor position, which is perfectly replaceable, like, by definition. You see what I mean, right? And when you're able to connect to company goals and the CEO vision of the company and like higher level motivations, and talk the language of business, essentially talk about value, not just the technology, all of a sudden you gain chances. You open a door for your company to, well, get a seat at the table and maybe have more strategic involvement and take more risk, make more impact. And obviously that allows for much higher revenue, right? Much higher profits. Because like on a vendor level, there is only so much you can do, right? It's hard to imagine that you can charge 300% of what the industry standard for certain services. It just doesn't happen until you switch to value-based thinking.
I just know from personal experience that sometimes it's just a matter of meeting the right person at the right event with the right people, wearing the right things, saying the right things in a charming environment that gets you in the door to be able to sell them on your product and then make them feel something. I think a lot of CEOs want to feel something. If they see that your preceding work obviously is up to caliber, then the conversation continues. And a lot of times I don't even touch the technical part of the conversation until the last minute and the contract's already signed. And then the CTO gets brought in. And this is what happens with big corporations. The CTO or somebody on the tech side, this poor person that's just trying to help with tickets for like 500 to 1,000 employees is brought in to quickly figure out how we're going to make this deal happen or how we're going to make this product go live on a certain timeline. So yeah, I think it just depends on who you're talking to and how they're feeling, to be honest with you, a lot of times, and what their MO is.
Gotcha. There are also some changes in the industry that I'm seeing, and you and we talked a little bit about lack of differentiation of studios and agencies, and I think it's very much the same whether you look at the digital ecosystem or the creative or visual ecosystem. I think that both sides of the table suffer the same lack of differentiation. But what changed in my perspective is that for the last 2 or 3 decades, we lived in the times where the industry wasn't really matured. And because of that, it wasn't saturated with technology, with solutions, with creativity, et cetera, et cetera. So like whether you were building, early content management systems, websites, no-code applications, or you were doing 3D animation, you were always on the edge. This was sufficiently novel to get people interested. And what changed in my perspective around 2022 when this crisis started is that we're seeing that the industry matured so much that nearly all the niches are saturated. And that means having your chops, having your technology, having your creative team at place, having great work on the reel is not sufficient anymore because everybody's got that. And the reel only gets you, the seat at a table, right? So we need to do more and we need to position ourselves better. In my perspective, it's focusing on value and switching from selling creative or digital services to selling outcomes, selling what these services enable. So broadly speaking, switching to a value mindset from a service provider mindset. Curious how you see these things, Sam.
I can't log on to LinkedIn without seeing an entire feed of 3D animation. 3D animation is the most accessible, I think, niche of the creative side that used to be almost unattainable. And now I can't log on or go online without seeing 3D animation. So, and it's so funny because now that we're so saturated with 3D animators, the prices have dropped down. So the projects that perhaps we could charge thousands of dollars to, you can scale it to maybe $1,000 or, there's so many different options of how to approach it. You can either be hyper niche and specializing really, really hyper specialized towards, say, having a portfolio to back you up, of having worked with broadcast, for example, not just social media assets, but working with broadcast assets. That's a different caliber of work versus, being a startup studio that's offering 3D animation. You're not really, to your point, going to differentiate between the next guy that's doing it freelance out of his studio. Like there needs to be other offerings that these creative studios are offering. So even dev houses, like you can't just be a dev house that does traditional WordPress anymore. That's not as sexy. They're not winning the FWA awards. And awards are all obviously like the way that you get more eyeballs and more attention to get more jobs in the future. So the way that you're going to stand out is by implementing, Next.js, for example, into your workflow and understanding how the interactivity part of a website works so that it's sexy, that it attracts people and it's something new. But even that isn't enough, because a lot of people really can't afford to invest into interactive websites, for example, because it's a lot of work. So it's the same mindset, for example, that people have in businesses. If you go to a supermarket, when you go to a supermarket, you go with the intention of buying one thing or two things, right? On the way to your checkout, you're plagued and you're waiting to pay and get scanned through. There's a number of things that you could buy, the candies, the gum on the way out. It's the same kind of mindset. You have to give little pockets of added value of service in addition to the main service that you want to offer. So if you're a web house, you maybe offer 3D rendering, or maybe you offer 3D animation. You could also offer 2D animation if somebody can't afford the 3D animation. So it's finding little pockets of ways to add value to your offering so that person feels like they have options depending on the variety of your budget. The other tactic is you want consistent clients, like maybe everybody wants the big fish of a client, because they want to feel good about their fiscal year at the end of the year. But a lot of the stability rides in the smaller jobs and the smaller consistent jobs. So maybe the 10K per month client or 5K per month client, let's start there, isn't as sexy, but it keeps the lights on. And for the companies that want to make it past these economic cycles that come every so often, they always happen. And if you want to make it through that, you have to have that kind of balance of small, medium, and large clients that you are always satisfying. Again, it's a lot of work. It's not sexy, but it makes you survive and outlast the rest. It's if you persist and persevere through these downturns that everybody's dropping off at. So, and those people are the ones that, we end up interviewing at conferences and on podcasts like that. So,
well, the kind of approach you're outlining in terms of like being flexible and having value-added services, I read it as a decent survival strategy for tough times. Like this is not going to propel your studio to become, the A-class player. But as you mentioned, for tough times, which we're still experiencing, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, the problem is you're competing with everyone else. So it's not a strong value proposition, right? It's only as good as your ability to attract clients on a personal basis, like make connections, spot the opportunity, and just get plugged in. So that's a way to service client, but not necessarily to win the client. But that's fine. That's definitely something that's usable during, fighting the hardship that we're seeing right now. At the same time, you mentioned one thing that many of these companies will drop off, and that we need to employ these survival tactics to keep the lights on, right? I'm not saying that's incorrect, but I embrace something like an early abandonment mindset in my career, because as I reflected on things that worked in my career, I found that I used to always sit on the bleeding edge. And as soon as a space got crowded, I was getting to the next thing. The only difference right now in 2024 is that I'm not seeing very clearly the next thing that excites me, which is a great question. Is it me getting fed up or saturated or, having enough technology and challenges, or maybe it's just the times that I'm not jumping on the boat of the AI excitement, and I have my reasons to do so. And there is not much other things promising. But anyways, my point being, it's okay to quit. Like there are waves. If you think about how the industry evolves, there are always waves. And this kind of like a surfer mindset, like build one company, jump on the wave, profit as much as possible, and then when the tide goes off and you're waiting for the next thing, this is exactly the moment to build your next business. And I think that looking at what's happening right now on the market, this is the moment for the companies to be spotting new opportunities and spotting the new waves to ride, instead of desperately trying to stay afloat. Let's be honest, many companies, they don't have right to exist business-wise because they don't have good value propositions, sufficient business operations, the right mindset. So that's absolutely fine that they are going down. And the only reason that many companies could survive over the last 20 years, even though they weren't ready business-wise, was that these were remarkable times, unsaturated and so hungry for creative services of all sorts.
Right. And well, for example, I know a development house in America who has a portfolio of businesses, right? So they have their dev tech studio, they have their investments for their firm, their real estate properties, and they also have some sort of, I think, food related business. So they have this multi-tiered organization, umbrella company, where one, maybe they're, for example, the last year, obviously with the industry and the economy the way it's been, they haven't made so much money on the tech side, but they have the other two parts of their portfolio that keep them afloat. And you see that strategy happening a lot with fashion houses, right? They will have a physical store where you're like, how are they still open? But, it's important for a Prada, for example, to be in a physical location, to have the name brand there, even if it makes zero sales. But for the branding of it all, it's important for them to be there and outlast as, a symbol, I guess you could say. And it's the same, it's similar for the creative, well, any of the studios that are dropping off now. The people that will survive this downturn, those services are always going to be needed. Oh, it's those customers are going to come back once the budgets are back, and the people that are still remaining will scoop up with that business. So it's just, kind of swimming with sharks in a sense, where if you outlast this downturn, even if your studio doesn't make money for 5 months, 6 months, whatever, if you can outlast and stay afloat while everybody else is dropping off and keep your doors open, eventually someone's going to come and, let the other people take focus on something else if that's truly what they want. I mean, I think everybody should be following their passion. And they're like, I'm tired of doing 3D studios. I'm tired of having a creative studio. This is what really excites me. It's a good gut check. It's kind of like a good mirror. I think these moments in our society of really checking in and saying, am I happy? Do I really actually enjoy doing this? Or was I just doing it to fill the time to make money? And for the people who are passionate, they're going to keep doing it. And they're going to outlast and scoop up the new business that's going to come in because the competition is going to be gone. Good for them.
You're right. This ties in with one observation that I had recently. I had numerous conversations, and I'm good at reading between the lines. And I call it the actual economy. And what I mean by that is that if you look at company websites, if you look at their social media, you may have an impression as a client that things are going as usual, that a 50 people agency is still a 50 people agency. But the reality is, the lights are on, but nobody's inside. Like, I remember so many examples of like agency founders I talked to, and it turns out that they are in the survival mode, having, the core team of 5, 7, or 10 people, whereas the agency still appears as a 50 people house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an exception. I think that's a standard these days. I just can't help but keep seeing these things. Once you see it once, you cannot really unsee it.
Well, Edelman is doing it. Edelman laid off 300 employees in the United States yesterday.
Wow. I need to add it to my list. I'm tracking the industry changes as much as I can. It's not always easy. So I have a list of companies that's heavily reduced, that did layoffs and that closed down. And it's very interesting because I have companies from like multinational VFX studios with like hundreds or thousands people, essentially restructuring and going down, all the way to 2 people motion design shops somewhere in the US. So an interesting thing is that this downturn shifted the playing ground to a huge extent. What I mean by that, for anybody who was a studio between 10 and 50 people, or maybe 100, depending on the niche and the kind of like business they are doing, the economy was the most difficult for these kind of companies. Because what happens, like if you are a super small shop, like on the boundary between a freelancer or a bunch of freelancers working together, so not even a proper company yet, it's much easier to survive. You're so flexible, you can always, be a little bit less expensive, a little bit more flexible, and you'll manage, right? At the same time, obviously, there is still work for top brands, and 2020, there was a massive amount of work for smaller studios. But what happened right now is that the budgets shrunk so much and the spending shrunk so much that the great projects are still there, but they are only coming to the top most established studios with the right connections, with like really, really established teams, staying at top of their game in terms of business and securing accounts. And that's how you keep these accounts, like animations for the new Apple launch or whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
But for everybody in the middle, it's ruthless. That's what I've been seeing.
It also depends on what you're working on, right? So, for example, with AI, I just had a conversation with a fairly large ad agency, and the business affairs person told me that, like, for example, with Runway has a lot of enterprise relationships with big studios and big companies. We just saw Coca-Cola launch their holiday campaign with that, having used Runway. However, what I have found out, there's a lot of legalese questions around who owns what, right? With AI, for example, it's actually not beneficial for brands to go through agencies to do their work using AI. That's why you'll see a lot of stuff being brought in-house. So I think a lot of big agencies are trying to figure out, because of the copyright laws that are still trying to be sorted in America, at least. I can't speak for Europe, but so when a human being creates an asset, in America, any asset that's created at an agency automatically belongs to the client that they're servicing, right? So they own that property. When a piece of art or something an asset is created with AI, because it's created by a machine, and again, all of that is still being figured out as far as who owns it, who created it, yada, yada. Technically, the brand has no ownership over that asset. So it's of no benefit for these brands to go through an agency. And it's much more profitable. It makes much more sense if they want to have ownership over their assets to either bring it in-house or hire a vendor to act like an inside party.
Right. But at the same time, it's very hard to secure copyright for the AI generated thing anyways, because the entire business model is founded on theft. So like even if you have it in-house, right, it's still not a very clean game and not very straightforward.
Well, I mean, that's why I signed on with Mimicry, for example, because we have only trained our models off of the client's data set. So every client, every big agency or brand has their own DAM system.
Yeah.
And so we train our models off of that. And if, for example, if they don't have something in their data set that they would like to include, then we create synthetic data. And that's the workaround. So as our product is, we specialize in completely private, secured systems. Whereas to your point, when I started telling people that I'm working with Mimicry, like this AI product, and the people who don't know enough about it, like, oh, this is your competitor and this is so I got a bunch of links. But really, these competitors are really just people who have taken a lot of third-party assets and then like put them together, put a little bow on and logo on it, and they're like, now we have a product. And it's like, yeah, that's secure. So yeah, I agree with you there, but there are solutions out there that can guarantee it, basically.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with this, and totally agree about the picture of the AI industry where there is so many SaaS companies being born, all of them like, bolting together a bunch of existing solutions from the source providers and, putting it together with a bit of duct tape and, offering it to the market. It's mostly crap. Anyways. They won't survive too long. It's like playing a lottery game, I think.
Absolutely.
There's no way to survive. But well, just to wrap it up, let's do a quick brainstorm. Let's try to imagine 3 things for studios or companies to bet on for the upcoming year or something like that. You go first. What are 3 good business ideas?
Yes. Oh, wow, you're really putting me on the spot here. I honestly, I can't say anything definite because it's evolving faster than I can comprehend. But I know that NFTs was a really big thing, maybe like a year ago or so. I don't think NFTs are going to go away. I think you look at Aura blockchain, which was created by LVMH and Prada and Richemont, I believe. I think we're going to see a lot more luxury brands implementing Web3 into their business solutions for authentication and basically upholding the value at which their products are sold. So for security, I think the cybersecurity era is coming upon us. I know that there's been a lot more discussion, about cybersecurity. I think people are getting more comfortable hearing that word, but I think the next big field is going to be cybersecurity working in tandem with Web3. I don't know enough about it, but I just know that that's going to be the next big thing that's going to take hold because Web3 solutions are going to become they're going to be more consistent. I think Web3 internet searches are going to be a thing as well. I think, right now everything's on Google, but and people are, essentially selling their data to be able to use Google's tool, but there's like, for example, there's a tool called Kaito, spelled Kaito, that's trying to create like a searching platform. That's not the best way to describe it, but it's sort of like that, where it's on the Web3 system, on the blockchain system, and you are not having to forego like any personal information to get information from the web. So I think a lot of that kind of stuff is going to be evolving and eventually it will equalize. I think it's going to keep scaling back and forth heavy. For the creative world, obviously AI, I think we're going to see a lot more AI creative startups, a lot of like competitors to Canva. I think there's a company called Uni who's kind of like a Canva, but using AI to create digital assets. I think digital assets are going to be easier to create for the common person who wants to, advertise their small business. So I think that's going to be the next big thing. I don't
So
know
the
if that answers.
business idea there would be to create another Canva, or
No, I think Canva is way too funded to compete with them. Really, and you look at Adobe Firefly and stuff like that, so that they have a lot of the same kind of features.
Mhm.
But I think the needs of small businesses are going to get hyper specialized, and going to be a new product that kind of combines all of those things together, but simplifies it. You can go to Canva, you can create a resume, you can create social media banner ads, you can really create a presentation deck, anything that you want. But if you want, like, for example, a 3D animated video, and you don't have the budget to pay a 3D animator to make something custom for you, I think motion tools that people can use on their own is going to be the next big thing that is.
it's happening, right? That's sort of what Runway is pioneering and a few other
Yeah.
companies. But that's not an easy idea for a startup, right? Because
No.
just to do these things right on the foundational level, this takes immense amount of like computation and expenses to set up a business of this kind. It's like maybe not comparable to OpenAI funding, but this is near that level. Like there is no fucking way a bunch of like smart people with a bit of creative and business experience can set up a company like that without external funding, right? I mean, if you have a good idea and strong playing cards, you may need to get funding, but
I heard somebody say online that in the next generation, that producers and project managers or digital managers are going to be much more highly requested because there's just so much out there now. And I think what they said is that they believe that there's going to be a need for people who understand how it all goes together, which I understand because from my experience, obviously speaking to studios that don't necessarily understand how things go together, you're going to want producers who know how these technologies work.
I guess that's in line with a nice prediction that I read recently, that the future and the most important skills of the future will be how you connect the dots, right? Because if you think about information and knowledge and expertise, everything is becoming so commoditized that everybody's got access to almost everything. The only question is like how you connect these dots. So that's I totally agree with this. Love what you said about the cybersecurity. I think that I didn't think about this like as an opportunity business wise, but in a broader perspective, I think we reached the peak hype of AI, especially with this excitement with large language models and video generation Runway and Sora and all these kind of things. So what's going to happen right now is that people and business will focus more on less flashy and less hypey and more like ground level technology, and how this technology gets implemented and what do we build with this. Because the world is becoming so much AI driven right now, I think that the personal data security and because cybersecurity, you instantly think about big corporations securing their data flow, right? But there is so much need for like small regular people to protect themselves from the AI theft and from data breaches, because this is the real danger right now. I just read a post on LinkedIn that someone was totally unaware of that, but their profile picture was used by someone else impersonating them, selling some shit that they didn't want, and that entirely ruined their reputation. And that's not a novel thing, but with the proliferation of AI and bots taking over, these things are going to happen more and more often. So I think that personal privacy in the future will be a big thing. I don't have precise business ideas around that, but that's going to be big.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, the next unicorn probably will be a business that will develop technologies that modify imagery in such way that they break the AI systems trying to learn on them, or modify them or copy or whatever that is, right? So you put an invisible pixel on a picture of mine and it's AI proof and you cannot really steal it. Or maybe that will be blockchain, I don't know. Cool. Lovely talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. Have a good one.